so in terms of thinking about biodiversity conservation, like I think I talked last time about how sort of my connection with nature came through these camping trips that I had as a kid every year for a long period of time. And as an only child, I had no choice but to go out by myself and sort of interact with nature. And E.O. Wilson has a very similar story. He grew up in the South and he spent a lot of time by himself outside looking at bugs and started to become connected with them. And ultimately, he's like one of the most famous ecologists ever. And he has this really neat quote. I won't read the quote to you, but it's specifically talking about how biodiversity conservation has to be directly tied to human well-being. And so the next thing that I'd like you to ask yourself is sort of like, when you think of the word biodiversity, like where do you think of biodiversity, like geographically, or in what kinds of ecosystems? Like when you think of the word biodiversity, like what image comes to your mind? Leah?
I think about rainforests or environments near the equator.
Okay.
Typically. Don't think of like things in like New England.
Okay. Other
ocean and coral reefs.
Okay, coral reefs, sure, also tropical. We'll go with Asher and then Nora.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say coral reefs as well.
Okay. Nora?
I was just gonna respond to Leah because I definitely do think of New England forests.
Okay, yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting, if you're from the West and you are a tree nerd like me, there aren't a whole lot of different tree species there. And so when I moved to the Northeast, I remember in my first class in graduate school in Pennsylvania, we had all these field trips because it was a forest geography class, and I had to learn all the trees, and I'm like, dang, there are a lot more trees out here. And yeah, so there is diversity in the Northeast, but it's like a human, there's a lot more people here, right? And so that actually kind of gets to my point that I wanted to make, which is that we often think, so do you think of urban spaces when you think about biodiversity? Do you think of like, or do you think of protected areas or large contiguous areas of intact ecosystems, right? That's usually sort of how we envision or think about biodiversity. And, you know, we think of like national parks, right? And if you recall from the last class, I showed you guys a map of the biosphere preserves, right? And those are concentrated in the global north. And so there is this kind of like narrative of colonialism embedded in some of our biodiversity conservation ideas, which is like, okay, Yellowstone, right? First National Park, Yosemite National Park, the Smokies. A lot of the parks in the Western United States especially have this terrible history of conquest associated with them, where people who were living in that area were removed, right? And Native peoples were stripped of their land. And so, you know, so this idea of this sort of like biodiversity wilderness narrative is something that's embedded in the way people think about biodiversity, right? We think about the tropics, but we think about like these large areas of preservation. And what we're seeing, of course, through development, is that those areas that are intact in places like the tropics are being degraded because of global consumption, of land use, land cover transition, right? For things like the agriculture industry to produce meat for the global north, right? And so, so there are like all these sorts of power relationships like embedded in the way we think about biodiversity. And it's something that, the reason why I'm talking about that is because it actually has a lot to do with how we think about being connected or understanding biodiversity. And so like, I would like you guys to sort of remember last week when I talked about the Urban Biosphere Stewardship Project or paper, and sort of re-envisioning ways in which you might think about biodiversity conservation, right? And so that's exactly what like the idea behind a biosphere reserve is that like the biosphere reserve, like in that buffer area, you have people living in that landscape and in that matrix, and you're trying to think about or promote sustainable livelihoods that are going to like minimize biodiversity loss, habitat fragmentation, and all the things that lead to biodiversity loss, right? And so I don't know, can I get like just a thumbs up or raise of hands of people who've heard the nature culture idea or narrative? Ever heard of the idea, of the concept of nature culture? Anybody? No? Okay, so that is, so if you are an anthropologist or you're a philosopher, there's a lot of literature out there on this idea of nature culture. And so but one of the issues associated with it is it's like this division between humans and nature. And so it gets back to like the original topics that we've talked about from the very beginning of the class of thinking about humans in nature and the idea of social ecological systems, right? And so biodiversity conservation is really at the core, is also like at the center of how we think about human and environment interactions, right? And so this nature culture idea continues to kind of like, and Latour is an author that writes a lot about nature culture, if you're interested. I know, Leah, you know some of that work, right? Bruno Latour. And so this kind of like tautology between nature and culture is embedded with how people often think about natural systems. And it's something that obviously we've talked about a ton in this class, but you know, that sort of tension and people's like idea of what biodiversity means is one of the reasons why like we haven't met these Aichi targets that were talked about, right? I don't know if you guys have heard of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it's a convention that came right after the Rio Earth Summit in the early 90s. And essentially what it is it's an agreement that every nation except for the United States has signed to try to conserve biodiversity. And so the Aichi targets were specifically a revisit to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's an international agreement, right? Signed by countries from across the world. I think there's 196 parties that have signed it. I think Andorra has not signed it either. There's maybe one or two other little tiny nations. And the idea behind the Aichi target was that it was a revision or a revisit to the original Convention on Biological Diversity, and it came up with these like additional sorts of like, it was like a reassessment to say, okay, well, where are we now and where do we need to go? And so if you actually like look up on the Convention for Biological Diversity, like it goes through 2020. The article specifically talks about how many of those targets haven't been reached. There was another meeting in February of this year to revisit these targets. So like one of the reasons why I think in general, like that list of like why we're not hitting those targets is related to this concept that I've been talking about how people envision biodiversity or whether or not they think about it in their daily lives or think about it other than this like protected area or large contiguous like tropical habitat type of narrative associated with how biodiversity works or where biodiversity is concentrated, right? So I'm sure you guys have seen these biodiversity hotspot maps. Has anybody sort of, I know some of you were in the intro class with me last semester, so why did we have those maps, those biodiversity hotspot maps? I mean, what are they, how are they made? Does anybody know like what goes into them? Can I call on somebody or can somebody just answer? How about, Grace, what do you think goes into those biodiversity conservation maps? Are you familiar with the biodiversity hotspot idea?
Yeah.
I know, everyone's on their bed and chilling out. So, but what do you think gets counted? Like when you go into a biodiversity hotspot map, Is it like every organism that's there? I won't put you on the spot anymore. It's not every organism that's there. It's just the plants, in fact. And so it's an easy, because plants don't move. That's why I study plants personally. It's because I can put a tree tag in a plant. There could be a wildfire or whatever. I come back, plant's still there. Sweet. I can measure it, might die or fall over, but I can find my tag because it's a sessile organism, right? And so there are a lot more data on plants than on animals that move around. Also, they serve as the habitat, right? And so the idea behind the biodiversity hotspot concept is that it's a mechanism to get a lot of conservation bang for your buck, right? So it means that you can conserve a lot of areas. So if you know where the biodiversity hotspots are based on the plants, the idea is that probably there are lots of animal species, insects, other organisms as well, that live in that matrix of high diversity for plants. And then if you can target that for conservation, you can pour conservation dollars and preservation into those areas where you're have high biodiversity, right? But again, it's this idea of the most natural places are the places with high biodiversity, right? But I think one of the things that we have been thinking about for the last couple of weeks in class is this idea of ecosystem services, right? There are these supporting services, provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, right? That the ecosystem provides us. And so tying biodiversity into that narrative of ecosystem services is an interesting way to sort of think about that, because like E.O. Wilson's definition of biodiversity, ecosystem services are really what provide us with well-being, right? Human well-being. And so if we can think about biodiversity in that context, rather than in the context of wilderness and biodiversity being inextricably linked, it sort of like removes this narrative or this history of colonization, of naturalists being encapsulated in protected areas only. We don't have to think about the eviction of people, for example. That's the history of how a lot of these protected areas came into being. And we can also sort of move ourselves away from like single species protection models. That's another thing that is often thought of when we think about biodiversity, right? So for example, I've been talking about this endangered grass that I'm working on. So over the weekend, I had to do this like assessment report. It was really long and like frustrating because I had to like go online and go to the Fish and Wildlife Service website, put in a shapefile, like a polygon of where my study area is, and then it generated a list for me of all the endangered species that are in the area where I want to do this work, where I'm going to do a restoration, right? So I will be like moving around, collecting seeds, planting, doing some raking experiments, and then also like planting new plants that we grow in the greenhouse after we collect these seeds. So like I had to go through for every single endangered plant or animal, like for example, the golden eagle is in one of my sites, and explain like whether or not my project would have no effect, and then actually explain why that was, may affect, and explain how it probably wouldn't affect, will affect, etc. And so those are the kinds of ways that like single species conservation models work. And, but at the same time, if we can sort of think about like how biodiversity works in the context of ecosystem goods and services, we can think at like the ecosystem level. And we can also think and amplify kind of the way we envision biodiversity conservation to include people and the way people interact with nature. And so I think what's interesting about this ecosystem goods and services perspective, which again, it took me a while to like kind of come around to understanding why I thought it was appropriate to even sort of try to monetize or value nature. You know, it just highlights the idea that people derive from and attribute to nature and their interdependencies, right? That we are interdependent on nature, and biodiversity conservation is at the core of our human well-being. Because, again, there are all these unknown things. Well, there are these known things that biodiversity provides us, but then there are all these unknown things that nature provides us, right? And so eroding these by all of the things in the article, you know, land use, land cover conversion, fisheries collapse, right? Harvesting, etc., is a real threat to our human well-being. And so So I think one of the main things that I got from the article, and which I think all of you got from the blogs when I read your blog post, was that there is this like idea of hopefulness, right? And so it was interesting when I assigned this article, I'm like, oh God, I really hope that these guys don't think that this is just another repeat of everything we've talked about before. And there is a lot of repetition in the stuff that we talked about before, right? But in this case, you know, I think that this is really important to think about, especially when we're living in this like really vulnerable time. So I was reading Sandra Diaz's, so she's a world leader in sort of thinking about earth conservation, etc. She just wrote an article since COVID-19 that she's posted on Earth People, which is like a website that tries to bring researchers, tries to do a lot of what the Earth System Governance paper does, but in a framework that's like specifically looking at biological researchers and then policy researchers. I like joined it, and now I'm like some member of whatever clusters are like appropriate to the research that I'm doing. But you know, so what she wrote about was really talking about under COVID-19, how, as you know, if you've taken Fred Cohen's class, and as you know, if you've read sort of about like how the disease was transmitted, is that from bats to pangolins to us, is that like our human interactions with nature are dictating some of the ways in which we're exposed to infectious diseases, right? And so by eroding the world's biodiversity and fragmenting these landscapes, we're putting people actually in closer proximity with nature in ways that could be dangerous, right? And so we've actually seen that sort of come to bear here in the Northeast with Lyme disease, for example. So Derlin Fish is an emeritus professor now at Yale, but he did some work in the early 2000s where he was looking at, basically he used land cover maps for New England and looked at housing and where people were getting Lyme disease. And essentially people that were in these like fragmented, like forest house interface had a much higher probability of contracting Lyme disease than people that lived in suburban areas that were not close to these forest edges. And edge habitat as well is a really high area for tick population because that's where deer move through. So deer like early successional habitat. Early successional habitat is common at forest edges, and so houses next to forest edges are places where people get a lot of Lyme's disease, right? And so that is a perfect example of this idea, right? Which is that if you can protect biodiversity and sort of manage for contiguous areas of forest, but also try to minimize our impacts in terms of fragmenting these forests more, you can also maybe make ourselves less vulnerable to pandemics. Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah, I think the Lyme disease example is so interesting because like I think I have this right from like Fred Cohen's class that like possums, when forest sizes are smaller, possums like struggle to survive in them, and possums are like a big deterrent to Lyme's disease because ticks will latch onto them, but they don't then like spread Lyme disease. And so I think it's interesting how like animals we don't typically like associate with giving us disease can like have such an impact on like whether we will get them. And so it's not even just like our direct exposure. There's like, I don't know, like compounding effects.
Right, and also at the same time, Japanese bittersweet, Berberis thunbergii, I believe it is a species that it's an invasive species. It's like it's like right next in front of the shut down frat house next to the COE. There's a big shrub hedgerow of it. It has red berries, has thorns. It's like an awful plant. I don't know why it was planted so heavily as an ornamental, but it's an invasive plant that loves these forest edges. And it's like infested with ticks. That's not that shrub. I'm just saying when it's in like a forest edge, that's a big tick habitat. And so I know some folks, like for example, that have worked at nature conservancy preserves, or I'm sorry, an Audubon preserve, and they have a hard time like controlling it because volunteers like shouldn't be going into like a tick infested area to try to remove it, right? But the same, so it's like an example of how like human activity has like totally changed like these disease vectors. So when we think about biodiversity conservation, that's really relevant, right? And maintaining intact forest is part of that. So So I had another question kind of, and maybe we can talk, how do you conserve biodiversity? What are the ways in which we can do that? So we already talked about like the big contiguous forest or coral reef or big preserve, right? As being one mechanism. And that there's a long history of thinking about conservation priorities in that way. So, so E.O. Wilson and also MacArthur, they came up with a theory of island biogeography as well, which is a very famous ecological theory from the 1960s, in which they looked at how island sizes and diversity were related to each other, and then also how the proximity of other islands and diversity were related to each other. And essentially, the bigger the island, the more species that you have. Also, the closer an island is to another island, the more species that you have. And so these studies were done on little archipelagos along the Florida coastline, actually. It's a crazy study. What they did was they like sprayed all these islands with insecticides, and then they watched the recolonization. You could never do this study today. And they counted the number of insects, and that's how they came up with a theory of island biogeography theory. But the idea behind it was that it could be used as a model for conservation. So essentially there's this it's called SLOS, single large or several small, as two different sort of conservation methodologies. And so one is that you can have this large contiguous habitat, right? That's the single large. And then the several small, though, is another conservation model, which is essentially one which I think is really important when we think about the future of biodiversity conservation, which is to say that in an increasingly fragmented world due to human activities, like we may need to conserve smaller areas of biodiversity and have them be near or make sure that we're also conserving other areas that are also close by that may have high biodiversity. And so when we think about like urban landscapes, for example, and biodiversity conservation, like we did last time, it could be really important, right? To have these islands of natural habitat or green spaces where plants and animals can live, right? And having them be close enough to each other that, you know, a pollinator could move from one to another, or an organism could move from one to another, gets behind this idea of like corridors, right? So you may have heard about biological corridors for birds. There's like there's like a wolf corridor that goes from, it's like Yellowstone to Yukon, it's called. And that's a biological corridor concept, which is similar to this idea of biosphere preserves, in which while you have people living in these landscapes, that they are working to conserve a corridor where wolves can migrate and have habitat patches that will allow for this preservation of the species. Another thing that's important is the idea of having habitats where so a bird, for example, might spend different parts of its life cycle in different types of habitat. And so it's really important to conserve all of the different pieces of habitat so that you preserve the species. Does that make sense? And so there's a biological concept that you'll learn about in ecology, but it's called metapopulation dynamics, that essentially looks at that. And it looks at this idea of like, well, and a metapopulation is just like a population of populations. But the idea is that if you like destroy one part of a habitat that serves as like nesting ground for a bird, and it only spends certain months there, and this is one of the things I had to find out on my species report, for example, for the golden eagle. Like one of the things I was able to justify for my permit was, well, I'm going to be doing the work in the fall, and the nesting period is at a different time, and so it won't be in this canyon. This eagle will not be in the canyon during the time of year when I'm doing the work, right? But if you destroy that habitat completely, then there's no nesting area, right? And that's essentially what happens with a lot of these large birds like eagles and things like that. So like ospreys, for example, they just came back north and they're nesting in Long Island Sound and around Long Island Sound now. But if you destroy their summer nesting habitat, then you destroy the species, right? So these are just some ideas that I wanted to bring up about how we might think about or conceptualize biodiversity conservation. One of the other things that the reason why I wanted to sort of set us up for this is that there's a recent article by Shi et al. In 2020, just came out like in February, that sort of talks about some of the barriers for thinking about biodiversity conservation at the local community level. And so, so I asked you guys to like envision the idea of biodiversity conservation. So what do you think some barriers for like your local communities are for thinking about biodiversity conservation? What would like your local residents in your town or your town council or whatever governance structure you have in place? DC probably doesn't have a town council, Grace. So what do you think some barriers are for getting people to think about biodiversity conservation? Any ideas? Maggie?
I think for me, like housing is a big one. Just like, I feel like whenever there's like zoning meetings that happen or like land that's getting sold, housing is always a big topic of like, there's always developers, especially like I'm in a suburb that's like very connected to the city. And so it's like a hot spot right now for like becoming more and more urbanized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that often prevents it.
Mm-hmm. Nora?
I had a question. How big do these smaller conservation areas have to be effective? Like, would a backyard garden count?
Yeah, so that's actually what I'm actually trying to get you guys to think about is like, yeah, you could plant a butterfly garden in your backyard, right? And that would serve as habitat to certain species, right? And I talked about that last time, kind of thinking about like, I was talking about Sam Bruno Mountain and Miles Brooks's thesis, where, you know, in the discussion of his thesis, one of the things that we talked about, or he talked about in his thesis, was specifically about kind of like trying to think about like these buffer zones surrounding protected areas, right? So you can think of like the several small idea as like a stepping stone. So how can we create a landscape where you have stepping stones for species to move among habitats? So what other kinds of barriers do you guys think there are besides like development? Mm-hmm. Leah?
I mean, this is sort of related to development, but I think it's interesting to see how communities like categorize this biodiversity in terms of like pests and like genuinely like natural things. Like I'm just thinking about in New York City. I think a lot of the animals that are present there are not wanted to be there, and there's kind of this push to like not have this environment be conducive to like life for them. So there's definitely like this differentiation between, are these like things to be preserved, or are they things that like should be not invited in this space?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, so determining what is valuable in terms of nature, so that's really important. Belle?
Building on that, depending on what like species you're trying to preserve, people can also feel like they're in danger if they're like on the edge of wilderness and people are trying to like preserve bobcats in that area. Like people wouldn't want these cats roaming around their backyard, you know?
Right. So that's a big one for sure. So people like large predators, for example, are seen as a threat. So a lot of times people like don't want to conserve them. So like, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this class or not, but one of my good friends from college, right before Yellowstone reintroduced their wolves, she has a giant ranch on the outskirts of Yellowstone. And she was like, so her mother was so angry about the reintroduction of wolves because it was a threat, right, to livestock and also to people saw it as a threat, right? And so one of the things as well, like, so when we think about like Fish and Wildlife Service is actually what regulates the Endangered Species Act. And so the way the Endangered Species Act works also can be seen as a threat to people. So for example, in Southern California, where I grew up, the kangaroo rat is an endangered species there. It's a cute little rat. It's Peromyscus is its genus. I think it's adorable, but guess what? It's like a death sentence if you want to develop your land. And so say you want to develop your land and you find K-rats on your property. you are completely restricted from developing your land because that invasive species is there. And so that's one of the reasons why our current administration has tried to basically unravel the Endangered Species Act, because it's a barrier to develop. So the other thing is, so we all know about biodiversity. Do you think, like, so my husband's on the town council, you guys know this, right? What do you think he knows about biodiversity? I already told you he's not an environmentalist, right? So that's another barrier, right? And that's actually what this article found, was that like a lot of decision makers like don't have this knowledge of what biodiversity is. They don't think about ecosystem services. And so that is not an agenda item. So not only do we have like kind of like different parties like turning over short periods of time, which is always a barrier to thinking about getting legislation of any kind through over the long term, but in fact also there's not a real awareness of why ecosystem services or biodiversity are like important to human well-being. And so going back to kind of like the article talking about those Aichi targets, that's one of the reasons why people haven't made these targets. Also kind of going back to the idea of human decision-making. Remember I gave you guys those long boring lectures a while ago on human decision-making, somewhere in the recesses of your mind, right? When we were in person. But so think about like how that applies to the biodiversity concept, right? So like if you are in a community where you don't think about biodiversity and you're not connected to biodiversity, right? Then people aren't going to be making governance decisions focused on biodiversity conservation, right? And so awareness is another big barrier. And this article talked about, remember last week, I also talked about this idea of like brokers in the urban biosphere stewardship article that I discussed. And those were people that could like move across scales to try to negotiate. This article specifically talked about champions doing the same exact thing. And so like the idea of like, not only like, remember when we talked about like cellular automata, right? And we talked about how and this is like very germane when we think about like COVID-19 and how it spreads. And we know, everybody knows this term like R naught and how many people you infect based on the surfaces you touch. Well, when we think about biodiversity conservation, if no one in your town knows anything about biodiversity conservation, there's very little chance that that information is going to infiltrate and move through your population, right? And so that becomes a barrier. The other thing is that, you know, there are not a lot of like laws that have any bite. Like, how do you find someone for, you know, for diminishing biodiversity? How do you figure out what that is, right? You can find someone for illegal logging or for, you know, polluting a waterway and things like that, but it's still hard. There aren't a lot of teeth to these ideas, right? And so that's why this article really focused on the importance of governance, right? And that we need to sort of make that connection with people, and we need to work with policy makers to try to bolster their awareness of the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem goods and services for human well-being, right? And so getting back to like the United States, like not signing on, what do you think, what kinds of consequences do you think that the border wall is having on biodiversity conservation? Like how might the border wall impact that? Which is a policy that's been pushed through by this administration, right? Any ideas?
I mean, kind of what we were already talking about, like just any sort of like intense like delineation or fragmentation is like kind of goes against just like the way that natural organisms interact. And so I guess like it would pretty harshly stop like migrations.
Yeah, so not only is it directly destroying plants, like so Oregon Pipe National Park is where some of the border wall is being constructed. And in fact, they're like just mowing down saguaro cacti and Oregon pipe cactus to like put in the wall. That's first like a physical disturbance, right? But then also, I mean, this may sound super dorky, but the reason why I'm like most upset about the border wall is because it's this barrier to animal movement and plant movement. And so you guys know that I work in Big Bend National Park. And so actually like the black bear hotspot for the whole region is the Serranías del Burro, which are in Coahuila. And Big Bend National Park actually didn't have any black bears when it became a park in the 50s. And those bears recolonized in the last like 15 years. Now there are bears all over Big Bend. And that couldn't have happened if there was a border wall, right? So we can think about how like the lack of like signing on to something like conventional and biological diversity is a political move, right? So why, it's also the reasons why the US isn't signing on to climate accords. Grace?
I was just gonna say, I also feel like it's important because one thing we've talked a lot about in this class is like the importance of building trust. And so like, I feel like it's a huge barrier in sense of like building trust between two different governments, and like how can we expect them to like be allies with us in building conservation if we're gonna just build this wall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that's been like the most rewarding for me out of this, besides that I want to save this rare grass, is that like I've built this like binational team that I'm like on WhatsApp like all the time with these guys in Mexico that are like, and we just got this new grant where we're going to be working together, and I got money for them to like have students doing work for 2 summers. And to me, like that binational collaboration, it's like so this transboundary idea, I know you guys, when you took the intro class, we started talking about like transboundary things in terms of thinking about pollution, but transboundary conservation is really tricky, right? And so, so you need to have this like coordination among diverse governments, right? And if you're eroding trust, then it makes that all the more difficult, right? So for all those reasons, I think that, trying to get people to think about biodiversity conservation as like an integral part of what conservation is really important. And this idea of like champions or brokers that can move across these different kinds of like institutional levels or governance frameworks is really important, right? From the local to like the regional or macro level. That's one of the reasons why actually like I was funded for this new project, because I had like the connects in Mexico. I had already like, they gave me this money because like I could actually like, I had like people that I was already working with. And so the lady at University of Texas in Austin that was competing against me didn't get the grant because she couldn't work in Mexico and didn't have those connections. But I've been working, in Mexico for a long time, and like these relationships are really fundamental when we think about sort of like large scale, large landscape, interjurisdictional conservation. So another thing that I wanted to ask you guys is, have you ever heard of this idea of payments for ecosystem services? Has anybody ever heard that idea, that term, payments for ecosystem services? Or does anybody know what it is? It is sort of it doesn't sound like you guys have heard about it, or maybe you have and just don't want to talk to me. But the idea behind it is it's very much like these carbon offset programs, right? So last week we talked about the REDD+, and sort of talking about like carbon conservation, and so paying people to maintain large carbon stocks, and that there was monitoring and verification involved in them. So payments for ecosystem services are exactly the same thing. So essentially it's the idea of like, so I think I also mentioned that my friend Shafkat has a snow leopard project in Pakistan that he's run this NGO for a very long time. He's from Pakistan. And, and the idea behind that payment for ecosystem services project is that if a snow leopard kills someone's cattle who's living in that region, the NGO will compensate the landowner by buying another head of livestock for them. And so that's the idea behind some of what payment for ecosystem services is. That's one structure. Other structures are like that you could basically be paid for maintaining and conserving fragile or high biodiversity habitats. And so that's also a model. Do you remember we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals? These ideas of payments for ecosystem services is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so part of the idea is that it helps these people living in areas of high biodiversity to maintain livelihoods, right? And so that's another concept that we've talked about, and sort of think about like how that may include traditional knowledge, right? That's another thing that the article discussed, was the importance of traditional knowledge and traditional ways of knowing and Indigenous peoples in terms of, so it's been well demonstrated that areas where you have Native peoples occupying and managing a landscape has more success in biodiversity conservation. And so if we can think about that moving forward and potentially like distill some of the issues associated with like the history of colonization, but sort of thinking moving forward of like how we might promote sustainable livelihoods for these groups of individuals through things like payments for ecosystem services is like a way to, or a model through which we might consider helping people maintain livelihoods, but at the same time conserve biodiversity. So there's also like this linkage between biodiversity conservation and carbon sink conservation. So the carbon offset idea and payments for ecosystem services idea, they're like very linked to each other. And in fact, a lot of the payments for ecosystem services projects are REDD projects that are like based on maintaining and bolstering natural carbon stocks, right? So you can see how some of these things might be linked together and how you might be able to work together to think about sort of the idea of like preserving livelihoods, preventing carbon emissions or lowering carbon emissions, right? One of you guys talked about the Project Drawdown website as being really a useful way for thinking about biodiversity conservation. And I agree with you that in my intro class, we've done a lot of we've used that website a bunch of different times this semester. So what I'd like to do now is break you guys out into discussion groups where we could talk about this a little bit more amongst yourselves. And then I have like an ending exercise that's similar to what we've been doing in Jill's class and then in the last class as well. So I want to ask you two questions. One is, what kinds of co-governance, remember we talked about co-governance, right? And then also like polycentric governance. These are words that are also embedded in this biodiversity literature as well. So I want you to think about like your local social ecological system, your town where you're living. And I want